This show may contain adult language and themes. Listener discretion is advised. With that out of the way, let's start the show. You're listening to the Murder is My Sign podcast, the true crime astrology podcast, and I'm your host, Jordy Death, here to let your way through the true crime astrology storm. Welcome to February, everybody. Hope you all had a great time listening to the Bonnie and Clyde series and the side slice that Kyle and I did. This month, we are covering the Ken and Barbie killer couple, Bernando and Karla Homolka. Kill now.
Barbie, let's go party.
Murder. I know, totally lame, but I couldn't help myself, guys. It was there for the taking, and I'm not that great with music editing. Otherwise, I would have done like a whole entire song like Weird Al Yankovic, but do it to the Bernando and Karla Homolka. Anywho, you're not here to listen to my crappy singing, but you gotta admit, that was kind of funny. And there's gonna be a lot of sound clips in this, so y'all just better be ready. So anywho, if you're wondering why Bernando and Karla Homolka are known as the Ken and Barbie Killers, well, it's because these two were like Ken and Barbie in the sense that they were beautiful, seemingly perfect, made of plastic. I mean, the last one is probably wrong, but you know, like, they're just gorgeous people that, like, were, like, picture perfect. You'd almost say the American dream, almost, but they weren't American. They were Canadian.
Right Canada! Right Canada!
So let's head over to good old Canada, Derry, and, begin talking about their most notorious serial killers, I apologize for that. Not really. So this is a story of two psychos falling in love and, well, raping and murdering teenage girls for fun. It's like that movie Bride of Chucky. Chucky and Tiffany, the killer dolls, except, they're dolls and not real, and Karla and Paul are unfortunately very much real and very much alive, and, just pieces of human fecal matter that somehow still manage to live because Canada does not have the death penalty.
Right Canada! Right Canada! Come on, Barbie, let's go party.
Alright, I swear, I'm done. I'll take a break. I'm just waiting for the cease and desist letters to come in. But I guess one of the perks of having a very small podcast that hardly anyone listens to is that, I go undetected for quite some time. Anywho, now I must say, with all the resources that I have at my disposal in regards to doing my true crime research, none of them really cover the childhood of Karla or Paul, which is really freaking annoying because, I get it. A lot of people just want to get into the meat of the story and they don't necessarily care about the upbringing of the killer. They just want to know what they did in graphic detail. But for the purpose of this podcast and the narrative that I like to provide you all, reading about the killer's childhood or their life that led them up to the point of them becoming a killer is kind of sort of important, So for the series that I'll be doing on the Ken and Barbie killer couple, I will be using a lot of sources, including 101 People You Won't Meet in Heaven, Deadly Duos, The Most Evil Women in History, Wikipedia, and the various documentaries that are available on YouTube. So anything that can really help me verify information and facts pertaining to these two assholes is what I will be using, because research is important, kids, and you need to cite your resources, and you need more than one resource. So, and that's something I've been noticing with a lot of my written books on the books that I use, is that, like, one resource might say something, but then it won't be repeated in another one. So that's why I like to have multiple sources. That way I can kind of verify more or less what's legit, even though this is all like tertiary, secondary research. So Okay, well, moving on. So let's start with Karla Homolka, who was born on May 4th, 1970 in Port Credit, Canada, making her a Taurus. She was the oldest of 3 sisters and grew up in a fairly normal middle-class family in Canada. Not a whole lot was written or mentioned about her childhood or life growing up, which leads me to believe that she was just a normal kid, probably. Nothing peculiar, nothing really sticking out as far as her being a sociopath or a psycho. Just probably a fairly typical middle-class Canadian, which I can only assume is very similar to America. They just have more hockey. As a teenager, she worked part-time at a pet store and would work later as a veterinary assistant after graduating high school. Now, Paul Bernando, on the other hand, well, he's a different story. He was born on August 27th, 1964, in Scarborough, Ontario, Canada. Great. Another Virgo. His family life, though, was not picture perfect. His father, Kenneth, was charged with molesting a young girl in 1975 and also sexually abused his own daughter, Paul's sister. His mother withdrew from the family and lived in the basement of their home, suffering from depression and abuse from her husband. Paul, for the most part, was a happy kid, according to resources, and very good-looking and well-behaved. He was charming, parents loved him, and he did well in school. But when he was 16, his mother told him that he was born out of an affair that she had had with another man. This seemed to cause a personality shift within Paul, and he began openly insulting his mother because he was so disgusted by her. Dark sexual fantasies began to play behind the charming facade that Paul carefully kept in place. He enjoyed humiliating women in public and soon began beating the women he was dating. For those of you playing along at home, doesn't Paul's childhood sound an awful lot like Ted Bundy? Remember when we covered Ted Bundy last year? He had this startling revelation of, not knowing who his father was, and then eventually realizing that his mother was, that the woman he was growing up with to believe that was his sister was actually his mother. And that kind of triggered him a lot. I think he was also very depressed and angsty about never really knowing who his father was. And I've kind of noticed also this trend with the people that we've covered, that when there is a lie as far as paternity or things like that, and the lie is coming from the mother figure, and the child is a male, it seems to kind of correlate that the male will grow up and then in adolescence will become very violent and have very violent thoughts and tendencies towards women. And I'm sure there's actual psychological research and proof on this, but just from my little observation doing this podcast for over a year, I've just kind of noticed that. I'm like, huh. So, don't lie to your kids about their paternity, and, just try not to be an asshole, I guess. That's all I gotta say. Anywho, so Paul, had this facade of being a really great, upstanding guy, and just like Ted Bundy, where he appeared on the outside to be very normal, well adaptive, and everything like that. But underneath all that, he was just this raging sea of violence and turmoil and hatred towards women. And he began raping young women in Scarborough, and the reports began to make the news in 1987. And these were brutal rapes, often including sodomy. And the rapes became so prevalent in Scarborough that the moniker the Scarborough Rapist was used in the news reports. In October of 1987, Paul met Karla while she was at a convention in Toronto for work. It was lust at first sight when these two met because they were sexually attracted to each other right away. Now, all the sources, with the exception of one, paints Karla as a sadist who would encourage Paul to continue his sadistic sexual endeavors. But in the book, The Most Evil Women in History, you almost get the sense that the author is trying to, I don't know necessarily like defend Karla with how she writes about her, but she definitely paints her in a less sadistic light. And this is a point that we'll get back to near the end of this episode when we cover the death of Tammy Homolka. Yeah, her little sister. So Paul and Karla are now dating and hooking up. Paul was studying to become an accountant at college and would spend his weekends with Karla and her family, which made it easier for him to integrate himself into her family. Karla's parents seemed to really take to Paul and his charming ways, and with his business degree in accounting, he seemed to be on the right track to be really going somewhere with his life. The two were seemingly very much in love with each other, even though Paul was showing his abusive side to Karla. All the while they were dating, he was continuing to rape young women in Scarborough, and it reached such a fever pitch in 1988 that Canada called in the FBI to help catch the rapist for fear that the rapes would soon turn into murders. Sometime during 1990, Paul proposed to Karla, and they became engaged. During that summer was when he first mentioned to Karla his desire to have sex with other women, particularly young girls. He justified this by thinking that it was perfectly normal and fine for a man to have more than one sexual relationship at a time, but it was not okay for a woman to act in the same way. The rapes continued while the FBI worked on profiling the rapist. The authorities had a vague description of the rapist. He was about 6 foot, slim, handsome, with light-colored hair. Eventually, they were able to do a composite sketch of the rapist thanks to the help of one of the victims that was able to see what he looked like and survived the attack. The sketch was so good that the wife of one of Paul's friends called the police and gave them Paul's name as someone to look into. However, according to Wikipedia, her statement was awkward and her way of speaking was strange, which made the detectives think that she was just trying to collect the reward money. But the detectives did cross-check several files that they had on hand and proceeded with bringing in Paul for questioning. So on November 20th, 1990, he was questioned and even voluntarily provided samples for forensic testing. The interview only lasted 35 minutes, and when the authorities asked why he thought he was being investigated for the rapes, Paul just remarked that he could see his resemblance in the composite. Regardless, he was released the next day with no apparent follow-up. It was also around this time that Paul began to talk to Karla about wanting to have sex with her younger sister Tammy. Now, this is where Karla's involvement with the plan seems to come into question because in the Evil Women in History book, the author states that Karla didn't want Paul to have sex with her sister, and she was, quote, totally against the idea, end quote. But on Karla Homolka's Wikipedia page, it states that she hatched the plan to have Paul rape Tammy after he became attracted to her. And in my 101 People You Won't Meet in Heaven book, it says that Karla was ready to do anything to sexually satisfy Paul. So when he demanded that she let him take Tammy's virginity as payback for the fact that Karla was not a virgin when they had met, she readily agreed and offered her little sister up as a sacrifice. Now, it should be said that Karla stated that she was totally against the idea while she was in court testifying against Paul, which, duh, of course you're going to say that. But we will cover the court trial and the whole shit show in another episode. But I'm just bringing this up that it's kind of hard to pinpoint, like, did she really feel this in the beginning, or is she just saying this in court to kind of cover her ass? It's kind of hard to tell, but I think we'll kind of get more into the psychosis and things like that in later episodes. So on Christmas Eve 1990, Karla and Paul gave Tammy sleeping pills in her eggnog, and when she lost consciousness, the two undressed her. Karla then applied a halothane soaked cloth. Halothane is a general aesthetic that Karla was able to get from working at the Martindale Animal Clinic. And I think it's still used today. in medical procedures? I'm not quite sure. But it is something that can easily cause burns when directly applied to the skin over a period of time. So while Karla and Tammy's parents were asleep upstairs, Paul videotaped Karla raping Tammy in the basement, as well as himself raping her. And as the cameras rolled, Paul demanded Karla to do various sexual acts upon her sister. Karla was neither enthusiastic nor willing to do these things. She wouldn't even smile for the camera when Paul demanded her to do so. Later, according to Karla, Paul severely beat her for not smiling on camera and ignoring his command. So in later videotapes, when Karla is seen smiling on camera, she states that it's only an act to make Paul happy so that she wouldn't ruin one of his videos or give him an excuse to beat her. Not like he really needed an excuse. He would beat her for just damn near anything. When the rape was over, Karla and Paul began to clean up. This is when Tammy began to violently vomit from the drugging. Karla supposedly tried to clear her airway by turning her over, and Paul attempted to do mouth-to-mouth, but neither one was successful. They called 911, and while they waited, they dressed Tammy and hid the video recorder and tape somewhere in the basement. Tammy Homolka died later that night at St. Catherine's General Hospital, and Karla and Paul put on a good show of their grief. They were each taken to the police station and gave their statements to the effect of Tammy had drank too much and fallen asleep, later waking up and vomiting and unfortunately choking on it. When asked why Tammy had red marks around her mouth and nose, well, Karla played dumb, having no idea where they were from. She later gave a lame thought that perhaps they were carpet burns from being turned over from when Paul and her were trying to revive her. But, of course, these marks were from the cellophane cloth that was placed over Tammy's face. Tammy's death was ruled an accident, and her parents didn't seem to question it. It was just a horrible event that could happen to anyone who drank too much, especially a teenager. Now, Paul had a videotape that he could use to blackmail Karla into doing whatever he wanted. Not that she seemed unwilling. To begin with, I mean, it really seemed from the various sources that I've read that she was really in love with this scumbag and was willing to do anything to make him happy and keep him around. Less than 6 months later, in June of 1991, Paul Bernando and Karla Homolka married. And you know what, guys? I think that is where we are going to stop this week's episode and pick up next week with the happy couple's life of marriage and love on Valentine's Day. I mean, what a great way to celebrate, right? Love, kinky fuckery, and murder. I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in to Murder Is My Sign. Please help out the show by sharing it with anyone you can, any way that you can. You can find Murder Is My Sign anywhere you get your podcasts or on your favorite podcasting app. You can also join the Boneyard and become a death head by supporting the show at patreon.com/murderismysign, just like my fabulous patrons, Michelle, Jake, Holly, and Crystal. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. You can also stay up to date on what's going on with the show and also my life by following me on social media. Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook are all at Jordy Death. That's Jordy Death. Or you can email the show directly at murderismysignpodcast@gmail.com. I want to thank you guys again so much for listening to Murder Is My Sign. I'll catch y'all next week with the next installment of Ken and Barbie Killer Couple Part 2. Until then, take care of yourself and each other, and rest in peace.